everyone to mute. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here at this moment, especially the panelists here. This has been a journey, a 2-year journey to get to this point where we're now actually having this conversation. My name is Taili Mugambee. I'm the executive director of the Ultimate Reentry Opportunity Initiative, where our work is to eliminate systemic barriers to reentry. And this means from the front end of incarceration, during incarceration, and even after incarceration. There are many areas that intersect this work: food justice, criminal justice reform, housing, healthcare, well-being, education, transportation, social services, and employment. URO utilizes a collective impact approach to solving these issues, and we have an unbelievable number of stakeholders in the community that take pride and commitment to improving our community for all people, not the least of which are the people impacted by reentry in the criminal justice system. And while it is true that systems are not working to serve the entire humanity of all people in our communities, we are working towards that vision. And this conversation is just a conversation that's part of the process. As we reviewed the reimagining policing recommendations, there were many who felt that it wasn't enough. And URO felt that we would like to advance these conversations to elevate the base knowledge of our entire community, so that when we visit these recommendations, that we are collectively working from somewhat of the same foundation. I'd like to thank first the Park Foundation for funding URO, the Ultimate Reentry Opportunity Initiative, since 2014 in this work. I think in this next year, you're going to see some groundbreaking advances in systemic change, things that we've been working with in our reentry housing, our data development, our Beyond the Box Employment Working Group, and also this podcast where we're going to be elevating the conversations about reentry and the impacts of the criminal justice system. So again, thank you all for being here in attendance. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to the moderator, Christa Núñez, an awesome human being in our community, serving to meet the needs of folks in a multitude of ways, least of which is her new school, the Learning Farm. So I'm going to hand it off to Christa.
Thank you so much, Taili. It is a pleasure being here with you and this amazing panel. I'm here personally because I believe in all of your work. I believe in the need to address America's obsession with free labor. I'm here because of the loophole in the Emancipation Proclamation, which means everyone's free unless you've been convicted of a crime, and the way that people have been exploited in this country, and how the decline of Black farms has coincided with the steep climb of folks who've been incarcerated. So thank you for having me. Without further ado, I'd love to jump into the introductions of the panel. I'm so thrilled that all of you are here. It's just a pleasure and an immense honor. I'd love for each panelist to spend about 5 to 7 minutes introducing yourselves, your work, your connections to this work, and why this conversation is important to each of you. So I will start in the order of our panel questions. And so Darnell, Epps, if you wouldn't mind being our first to chat with us and introduce yourself. Oh.
Hello, yeah, everyone can hear me? Yes. Yeah, I'm Darnell Epps. I'm formerly a student of the Cornell Prison Education Program. I currently work as an analyst for Ithaca S&R, where we work to advance technological equity on behalf of incarcerated college students. We believe strongly in digital literacy and that reentry begins on the inside before folks are released. What motivated me to get involved in this work and to join this discussion was just my background. I was justice involved. I was incarcerated at the age of 20. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. Never really seen myself as an academic, and I dropped out of school in the 10th grade. I was raised in the projects in Brooklyn, was very much into athletics, wasn't the bookish kid, but eventually that changed. You know, I was incarcerated at 20 years old and served a sentence of 17 and a half years to life. At the time that I entered the prison system, I didn't know I would ever get out. Only 3% of violent offenders were actually being paroled at their first parole hearing. Pataki had been reelected on a platform of abolishing parole, and truth in sentencing, which was ushered through the crime bill, really influenced states to adopt more punitive sentencing measures. And so when I entered the prison system, not only had mass incarceration reached its peak in some respects, but there was also this disinvestment in educational programming on the inside. Pell Grants had been eliminated through the 1994 crime bill as well. And it wasn't until 2012 that I began taking individual college courses in prison through Hobart and William Smith colleges, and eventually a degree program that was offered through the Cornell Prison Education Program. It was at that time that I took my first college course. I earned my GED in 2001 at the age of 21. And that was the highest level of educational attainment that docs had offered at that time. And I was fortunate through the generous philanthropy of the Mellon Foundation to actually enroll in a degree conferring program through the Cornell Prison Education Program in 2016. I was paroled in 2016, despite the odds. The law had, changed somewhat in New York around the parole system and whether it would focus solely on a crime of conviction or it would be a more forward-looking process. And even though it was still difficult to make your first parole board in 2016, my brother and I did. And I matriculated at Cornell in 2018. I graduated in 2020, majored in government, minored in law and society. And I'll be pursuing my dream of attending law school at Yale Law School in the fall of 2021. So yes, I'm very passionate about college programming in prison, higher education in prison. I look at the work that The Last Mile is doing out west. And I also am very passionate about reentry and the kinds of services that are available to folks on the outside and the community support that's needed to really get people to maximize their potential. I was fortunate to come to Ithaca despite being from Brooklyn and have a tremendous community of support. I give tremendous credit to so many folks of helping me get to where I needed to be. And that's the type of support that everybody needs. So that's why I'm engaged in this work, and that's why I'm happy to join this discussion right now.
Thank you so much, Darnell. Brother, I cried over you. You are the person connecting the dots. Dr. Jamila Michener posted a little bit about your story a few months back, and I literally shed tears. It's so good to see you. Sorry, I had to say that. I'm actually not going to go in order. If it's okay, I will jump over to Dr. Jamila Michener, who's joining us as well, because I'd love for her to follow up to what you shared, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, totally fine. And I love that you said that, because I brag to everyone about Darnell in every venue that I can find to brag. One of the things that continues to keep me motivated in this work is just being connected to real people who are amazing, incredible people. So, I've been teaching in prisons for a few years now with the Cornell Prison Education Program, and I'm chair of the advisory board for the Cornell Prison Education Program right now. And the first class that I ever taught in prison, Darnell was actually a student of mine. And I remember the first assignment that we gave, I had some Cornell undergraduates with me who were teaching assistants in the class. And we had divvied up the assignments between the three of us, and we were all going to read them and try to work on feedback. And on the way, driving to 5 Points Correctional the following week, we were talking about the assignments and how they went. And one of the students was like, oh my gosh, some of them were so amazing. Like, there's just so much brilliance. And I was like, oh yeah, definitely. We weren't surprised, but Darnell was one of those students that from the beginning, it was just like, wow, there's so much brilliance and potential and possibility and talent here. And I always felt sad leaving the facility at the end of our class time, because it was such a rich and generative time. And I was learning so much from my students at 5 Points, and it was just such an amazing space. And then to leave and to know that so much of that possibility got shut in behind me as I left that facility. And it was hard to just transition back into regular life and be like, oh, all right, everything's normal. And beyond my role with CPEP, I think that there are lots of ways I've engaged with this work over the years. I've been a part of URO's data development team, and we've worked in various capacities to try to learn more about what's happening in the county and in the city with respect to incarceration and policing and reentry. And we've tried to get different kinds of data, analyze it, understand the kind of state of affairs so that we could think about how to change things and make it better. And have learned a lot along the way with projects that have involved everything from collecting demographic and statistical data about the county to interviewing and talking to people in our community who are formerly incarcerated about their experiences and the wide variety of challenges that they face. So that work has brought me to a point where my understanding of these issues is more than just theoretical, right? I teach a class on campus at Cornell called Prisons, Politics, Policy. And I usually have 100 plus students who are really interested in learning about criminal legal systems. And I love teaching that course, and I love how invested my students are in understanding these topics more deeply. But it's a totally different thing to then be living in a community, learning about what life is actually like for people in our community who are affected by criminal legal systems in a wide variety of ways. And also knowing folks who are affected by those systems in a wide variety of ways, caring about those people, right? Being in community with them and making common cause with them. And I think that from what this means for me and my vantage point is that from every aspect, from a personal aspect in terms of my social relationships to a professional aspect in terms of my research and my engagement with URO and other different entities throughout our community, to just in many ways, I think for me, like a kind of deeper spiritual aspect, like this is about our shared humanity and the role that we all play in enacting practices that kind of recognize and reflect that shared humanity. So that's motivated me in doing a lot of this work. And I'll just end by saying that these are difficult topics. And one of the things students always say at the end of the semester in my prisons course is like, I cried so much this semester. And then I feel bad because I'm like, well, my goal isn't really to make you cry. But I also tell my students, my goal isn't to isn't to shield you from that, right? Because this is hard and it is painful. And a lot of people are experiencing pain and trauma. And so we should all care about that and be affected by that. And so, this discussion I appreciate, but it's not an easy discussion. And the solutions aren't easy either. I was actually a part of the reimagining collaborative and helped to do some of the focus groups that informed the report for that. And, the whole time I wondered, like, what is this going to amount to? Is this, am I contributing to something that will be a part of a deeper, more transformative solution? Or am I just lending cover for, you know, baby steps, marginal changes that won't really lead to anything important? I struggled with that throughout the process. I continue to struggle with it now. It's really hard to know the right way to position ourselves to get the kind of change in these systems that we want and need in ways that are going to respect and reflect our commitment to our shared human dignity. And so this is hard stuff, and I appreciate everybody who's having this conversation with us and trying to work through it and figure it out.
Thank you so much, Jamila. I'm hearing that the YouTube channel has potentially changed, one of our beloved interns. So I'm just mentioning that if you are having trouble accessing this conversation, please go to URO's YouTube page at youtube.com/channel/UC. And there's some others, so we'll post that and you can access it if you're having trouble. Thank you so much. We will move on to Shawanna Vaughn, if you would like to introduce yourself and share a bit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this invite. I think this is amazing and such an important topic. My name is Shawanna Vaughn, and I'm the director of Silent Cry, and I'm formerly incarcerated by way of California. And I know that trauma is such a real thing in this country. Such so that the therapist on my board, Dr. Cornell Griffith Hunt, explains to us that trauma happens even in birth. So if that is what is to be true, I was born in prison and I was vended to the foster care system. And at 17, I went back to prison. And so I realized that we are in trouble. And I like the fact that at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about the different cycles of incarceration. Here feeds into the prisons. My paperwork said juvenile recipient of California transferred to the Department of Corrections of California. And I was like, whoa. And not until I became an adult did I actually look up and understand that. And so out of my own silent tears, I have an organization called Silent Cry. And I do mass incarceration, foster care, and gun violence. And in this moment, I realized that we are suffering in silence, and people behind the wall are not invisible. And so I've written policy and legislation called Post-Traumatic Prison Disorder, Shawanna W76337. When you go to prison, they strip you of your name and they give you a number and they brand you like an animal and say, this is you. I've decided to take their branding of an animal and say, this is not me. So I'm going to use your number and I'm going to. That is good. And so I turned it into policy and legislation. So if you want me to forever be this, it's going to forever be remembered like this. Mass incarceration and mental health is, nobody ever addresses it. It's a good conversation, it's a good piece of paper, but it's never put into practice. So I have one of the only mass incarceration mental health bills in the country, when that should have been the first thing running out the gate when anybody decided to fund or talk about incarceration. If you are not mentally well, you cannot be here. And recidivism happens because nobody ever deals with the trauma of a human being. I was traumatized 9 times before I ever got to prison. That's how I got there. And then when I got to prison and got called a cunt every day for 5 years, that traumatized me more. And then I had to come home, be on parole, and they said function. Well, being a female is different than being a male because men had programs, men have families. Men have women who are going to support them no matter what. Women and girls do not have the same luxury. Nobody answers the phone. And when they with $40 and a bus ticket, what are you gonna do? And then they say thrive. Well, I'm mentally damaged and broke. How can I? I have spent the last 15 years in therapy just trying to get to a place of normal because you snatched me out of my habitat, whatever that was, and you sent me into something abnormal, and you expect me to come and be functional. That's not possible. And I realize that recidivism happens because we don't want to deal with trauma. We are a punitive carceral country because we live off the back of 1619 and we function in profit over people, especially Black and brown people. We like slavery. We don't want to do any work on our own. So we keep incarcerated, especially women. Women are incarcerated 19% higher than men right now. And everybody is ignoring that they're here. And I often say, you know, we talk about slavery being 400 years. No, I was born to a mother shackled in chains. So I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I was born on a plantation. So slavery for me is only 43 years ago. I don't know what it looks like for everybody else. And so I know that the only way we are going to get anywhere is if we teach individuals to right themselves out of what the Declaration and our forefathers wrote us into, which was racism and white supremacy and slavery. And so I am avidly teaching incarcerated people in 4 prisons how to write policy and legislation. I am avidly teaching myself how to write policy and legislation. Because the only way to break the cycle is to stop getting handouts and make self-sufficiency a priority for incarceration. And I don't see that happening. I don't see anybody saying, you know what, we see the data, we have the research, we actually know how to fix it, but it'll stop the Dow Jones if we actually accomplish. Because if you fix people's mental health, you can put our community back together. And we've neglected to do that. And I actually say shame on everybody who speaks of re-entry, because how can I re-enter society when you never prepared me to come here? And so we talk about all the programs and all the systems and all the things, but we have people who can't even write a victim impact statement because they can't even come to terms with their own trauma. So now we're holding them up from ever being free because nobody's dealing with this trauma. So I'm here today, and I think this is so important. And I really just want support around the country to galvanize behind my legislation, because we have to heal. And I believe that redemption is for everybody or nobody. And so I'm asking for support from everybody in anything that looks like. Because I believe that this legislation is important, and I believe that legislation for incarcerated people should be written by incarcerated people. And I think we need to push towards self-sufficiency for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people and wholeness. So I'm here because you are talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, and I am suffering. Listen, I got to go to Columbia through CJI, and I'm very appreciative for these opportunities that are being afforded to me. But I need to know how to make these opportunities afforded to everybody like me, after me, because they're not afforded to everybody. And we're being picked out and we're being chosen. And sometimes I feel like I'm a grandstanding showman, but there are the multitude that deserve the same opportunity. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we leverage the playing field all the way around the board? So for me in Silent Cry, my first act is mental health. And this is why I'm here. So thank you guys so much for this opportunity.
Shawanna, thank you. Thank you for your work. It is an honor to be here with you, sis. Thank you so much. Jessye, Cohen, Filipic. Would you like to come next?
Sure. Yeah, in some ways, Shawanna, I don't want to follow you at all, but in other ways, it's a great transition. So I'm a counseling psychologist by training. In counseling psychology, I mentioned the subdiscipline because we're really trained to do direct individual clinical work, but we're also trained in community-based interventions and to think systematically and to pay attention to disparities. And that was an integral piece of my training. But before I went back to become a psychologist, I thought I switched. I'll spare you the circuitous path of my education and my post-graduation work, but I finally decided I wanted to work in direct mental health services, and I was going to go get licensed as a master's level counselor. And my first job was in a jail, a county jail. It wasn't even my job, it was my graduate internship in my master's program. And I was woefully unprepared for that, and it completely changed my life. So I lived in Virginia, and I worked at a county jail, and there were 2 sites of the county jail, and one of them looked like what you saw on TV. More than 50% of the people incarcerated in that county jail, this was in the early 2000s, more than 50% had a serious mental illness and were often housed in the specialized mental health unit or in the SHU. And so my job as this baby master's student was to provide counseling, and I was terrified and I was not prepared, except that guess what? I was, because I could be empathic and I could listen and I could respect the dignity and humanness of people. And honestly, that's all people were asking for. They deserved so much more. But at that time, there was a real tension between the correctional staff and those of us who came in as these sort of, pushover clinicians. But people had to submit a slip to come see a counselor, and often it would take them a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week to get in. And sometimes they just did it so they could be in a different space with different energy and have someone who would be kind. And so that was at one site. And then I moved to the other county jail. And again, this is outside of Richmond, Virginia, in a rural area. And it happened that the sheriff was a rehabilitation counselor by training. And so this Podunk County Jail in Virginia was an open campus. Everybody went outside all day, every day to get between the buildings. Being in fresh air made a difference, but they also were, again, this is in 2001, the resources available for treatment for substance use disorder, for counseling group and individual, for educational and vocational training was actually amazing. Still not a place I think should exist, but the stark contrast between those 2 places, still miserable conditions in many ways, and still not a place people should be, but the functioning of the people who lived there, who had air to breathe and space to move around, was really striking. I also had in the back of my mind, I'd grown up in a family where we talked, my parents were involved in a lot of different sort of social movements and social change. And one of the stories I told Taili in an initial meeting was about my parents 50 years in Syracuse doing some police training, teaching de-escalation techniques. And the police got so mad at my mother, who was, 5'3" and probably, 120 pounds at the time and had long 70s hair. They got so mad at this little white woman and they maced her in the face. And that was a story I heard when I was really young, right? Like, this woman carried privilege and still carries privilege. And they got so upset just being told and trained at that time how to not get angry and violent that they maced her in the face. I watched my brothers get pulled over and face no consequences whatsoever, even if they had a bag of weed sitting on the seat of their car. Things I shouldn't be saying on YouTube, probably. I was acutely aware that I lived in a segregated state, in a segregated town, in a segregated nation. And it's not like any of that was new to me, but when I walked in and saw the disparities in this county jail and the conditions and the sentences and the treatment, that's where my passion was sparked. And I've done a lot of things since then. Fast forward a little bit, so I'm faculty at Ithaca College, and I work with students who want to go on and work in human services and social services. But for the last year and a half, I've been at Reach Medical, which is a harm reduction, low threshold clinic that offers an amazing array of services. And I've developed the behavioral health services here and work to create a trauma responsive mental health service. And not surprisingly, we are working with with the same set of people who are struggling post-incarceration to figure out what life looks like, who are still coming in and out of incarceration, living through that cycle. And so I'm back to doing that direct clinical work and supervising clinicians, working with people and trying to figure out how to get them connected, again, in a community that has a lot to offer and still requires, I just, so much of what you said, Shawanna, resonates with me in terms of talking about reentry. We don't give people any tools to get out the door, a bus ticket and a bid you farewell. So I think I'll leave it there, but I have a deep commitment to working within this community and the broader community. And I'm so deeply grateful for your work on policy, because I am committed to responsive clinical services at whatever level, including in prisons and jails as long as they exist, to help mitigate that trauma that people bring in to incarceration with them and that they experience when locked up. So thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
We're excited to have you too. Thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning, Shawanna. If you want to share in the chat or somewhere when you speak again, how we can support your legislation that you're writing, that would be great, so we can know how to interact with what you're doing. Thank you, Jessye. Let's move on to Rosa, Dr. Rosa Brooks, please.
Thanks so much. You've given me an honorary PhD. I'm just a regular law professor, but thank you.
Look like a doctor to me.
So I'm a law professor at Georgetown, and before I became a law professor and early in my law professoring career, I spent a lot of my time working for human rights organizations. And in that capacity, I worked on a number of prisoner rights issues and issues of police abuses in other countries than the US, ranging from Jamaica to South Africa, to Kenya, to Kosovo. A few years ago, I did something crazy during a sabbatical. I learned that Washington, DC has a program, a reserve police officer program. It's a volunteer program that anyone in the community can volunteer to be a cop. And incredibly enough, they will put you through the police academy and give you a badge and a gun. I thought, even a law professor, really, that's not a good idea. But when I heard about this program, I thought it was just really fascinating. I still find it very strange that this program even exists. But I decided to go into it. I wanted to see what it was like. I wanted to see how police officers make sense of their roles. And one of the things that as an academic, as a scholar, has always been fascinating to me is the relationship between law and violence and the kinds of narratives, the kinds of stories people tell to try to explain or justify or delegitimize different kinds of violence, whether it's their own or others. And I thought it would be an amazing opportunity to get inside that blue wall of silence, if you will, and get a better sense of why do police do the things they do? What stories do they tell themselves and each other? What stories do they tell their families? How do they make sense of their role? So I did it. I became a reserve police officer in Washington, DC. And first I thought I'd just go through the academy and then stop. But by the time I'd gone through the academy, I thought, well, I might as well see what it's like to be a patrol officer. So I did that. And in DC, reserve officers, even though they're volunteers, still have the same police powers as full-time career officers, same arrest powers and so forth. And you just partner with career officers or with other reserve officers, and you respond to 911 calls and so on. It was a really fascinating experience. It was exactly as fascinating and bizarre as you might expect. And two things came out of it for me. One is a book that came out a couple of months ago. It's called Tangled Up in Blue, Policing the American City. And it draws very much on those experiences. The other thing that came out of it was a real, sense that I didn't need to become a reserve officer to get this sense, but it really drove home for me how poorly prepared most police officers are to encounter the things that they encounter, to do the things they do, to take on the tasks that our society has given them. at this moment in time. And so together with several of my colleagues at Georgetown, my colleagues, Paul Butler, Christy Lopez, Chris Henning, and Sean Hopwood, we started a program called the Innovative Policing Program. And the pilot project for that is still going on today. It's called the Police for Tomorrow Fellowship Program. I know it's kind of a corny name. I actually didn't like the name, but I got overruled by my colleagues. But what that program does is we take young police officers, and it's a collaboration between Georgetown and the DC Metropolitan Police Department. We take young police officers, they apply for this fellowship program. They have to write essays and give us their resume and be interviewed. And it's a competitive process. So we select about 20 each time. We're now in our third cohort. And what they do is they come to Georgetown and sometimes to other places in the city for very intensive workshops on essentially the hard questions of policing, race in policing, violence in policing. What is good policing? Do we know? Do we have some shared conception of that? Do police officers think they have a conception of what good policing even means, or what the role of police in a diverse democratic society should be? If we think we know what good policing is, do we have the faintest idea how to measure it, et cetera? We push them to talk about all those issues. We also push them to think hard about issues that range from adolescent brain development. Why are the teenagers you encounter going to mouth off at you? Well, because guess what? They're teenagers, and that is what teenagers do. And how do we get officers to understand that an obnoxious teenager is not predictive of a life of crime, and an obnoxious teenager is predictive of basically being a teenager, and most people grow out of it. We put them together with local high school students, with local police reform activists and abolitionists. They have really good conversations. It's been kind of an amazing program. And again, I know it sounds sort of corny, but as a teacher, you live for those moments where you see people really being transformed by an experience. And I think that both for some of the law students who've been involved in this program and some of the officers, it's been really transformative in terms of really changing how they think about their role. I think the police department's a little bit grumpy at us because some of them really changed how they thought about their role and decided they didn't want to be cops. They wanted to be police activists for transformation. I think from our point of view, that's great. They have a unique voice now to go out there and be advocates for change, because they can speak with the credibility of, I was there, I did this, I do know what it's like, and I think so often activists get dismissed with, oh, you don't understand, you just don't know what it's really like, and they will be able to go out there and not be dismissed. So we are as proud of the fellows who have left the department as we are of the fellows who are advancing within the department. And a couple of things I'll just mention before I stop, that we've done that relate a little bit more directly to what we're talking about today. One of the things we did is we brought all our fellows to the DC jail to spend a morning with prisoners, talking to them, very open-ended conversations. And those two, I mean, it was such a powerful experience for the fellows. We brought with us the police academy commander, and he was so bowled over by it that it's now, COVID has delayed this somewhat, but it's going to be a requirement for all recruits at the police academy in DC to go through that program. And I think it goes back to some of the things others have already said about how do you get people to see each other as humans with stories, not as caricatures, not as stereotypes, not at, and it was incredibly powerful, I think, for all of them. We also invite, I don't know if any of you know the group Free Minds, which does writing workshops in prisons. And we brought some of their folks who were formerly incarcerated, came and spoke both to our fellows and spoke to all the recruits at the academy, and talked not so much about the writing that they did through the program, although we also had an amazing book of poems that they had produced, but talked about just the experience of being incarcerated and what it was like. And that too, I think, was, it ended with the crustiest old sergeant at the academy, the sort of drill sergeant guy, ended up in tears hugging the speakers. And I don't want to pretend that, if we all just get to know each other more, everything will be fine, right? I mean, obviously there are really deep structural problems with policing in America, with incarceration in America, with the whole criminal justice system, beyond the criminal justice system. And programs like this aren't going to change structural racism. They're not going to change the laws that often shape how policing works in this country and so on. But I think, you know, many of the other things we do in the Innovative Policing Program are really focused at trying to kind of walk that tightrope to say there's a long-term issue and there's a short-term issue. In the long term, we want to be reimagining public safety. We want to transform policing. Some of our folks want to abolish policing, you know, but to have those discussions about what do we think public safety should look like in 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, whatever time frame you like, how do we get there from here? You know, what capabilities would you need outside of policing? What people, how many, with what money, with what kinds of training, to have those conversations as part of the programming that we do, not just within that Police for Tomorrow program. So there's that long-term conversation. But I think there's also we have very much a focus on harm mitigation in the short term. And I always have this debate with my students, most of whom are police abolitionists, about is there any value to reform efforts? And many of them at least start out with, no, you know, you're just moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, or as Professor Michener said, there's a worry that you actually end up giving cover to the structural problems and making people go, oh, ho, ho, we did this reform now, you know, pat ourselves on the back, now we're done. And I think that is a real danger, but at the same time, I think some of the short-term reform efforts and harm mitigation efforts can save lives and transform lives in the near term. And that's not nothing, you know, it's not everything, not even close, but it's not nothing either. And so, you know, to that end, some of what we talk to our fellows about is trauma, both the fact that many of the people they encounter when they respond to calls, when they respond to radio calls and so on, are people who have been severely traumatized already by crime in their neighborhoods, by seeing other people who are victims of crime, by seeing other people who have been victimized by police officers, who've been incarcerated, by seeing the harm that does to families, by experiencing very often that harm themselves. And talking to the officers about what does trauma do to people? What does trauma do to how they respond, how they make decisions, what might be triggered by you showing up in your uniform? And we also talk to the officers about trauma for police officers. You all probably are aware that the biggest cop killer in the country is suicide. Every year, more police officers kill themselves than are killed by every other cause combined, intentional acts and accidents, et cetera. Policing is the way American policing works right now, at least, it is traumatizing for the officers as well. And we talk to them about the ways in which their own trauma, you know, the fact that you're seeing dead bodies, you're talking to rape victims, you're seeing abused children, you know, you're seeing a lot of humanity at its worst, a lot of people at their most unhappy, at their angriest, most destructive or self-destructive, and the ways in which those traumas can actually also affect the decision-making of police officers, and that a more trauma-aware approach to policing needs to take into account both, hey, you officer, be self-aware about the ways in which your own trauma may affect your interactions, and be aware of the ways in which trauma may affect the actions of the people who you encounter. Will it, again, lead to major structural change? I don't know, we'll see. But I think in the meantime, there's a long in the meantime. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much, Rosa. I really appreciate you sharing the important work you're doing, bridging those gaps between municipalities and police forces and academia and the community. So thank you so much for sharing that. Last but not least, Sabrina, Karim, please.
Great, thank you. And thank you to URO and everyone else on this panel for, I feel like it's my privilege to be here with everyone else on this panel, and for URO for hosting such a great conversation and such an important conversation. So I'm very thankful that we have this group in our community. So I guess I'm here to kind of provide a little bit of context, kind of stepping away from the US for a bit and to provide some kind of global context. So I'm an assistant professor in the government department with my wonderful colleague, Jamila. And I study, I'm a comparative politics person. So that basically means that I study countries outside of the US, in particular policing systems in countries outside of the US. So I've done I've looked at policing in Liberia, Zambia, Senegal, Jordan, Peru, just to name a few. And as I do this work, the questions that I ask are kind of trying to understand why police violence happens in these countries, and then as well as when do we see institutional changes. And by institutional changes, I think we normally think of reform, like we're moving towards more oversight, or these kinds of policy solutions, if you will, short-term solutions. But also, I think it's really important to try to also understand when we see movement in the other direction towards more militarization, right? We need to understand when we're going to face more danger for the communities that we work in as well. And so, as I was doing this work, the events of last summer just kind of really demonstrated that this international perspective and global perspective is really interesting, but really, if you're not looking at the U.S. and including it in this analysis, then it's really really not helpful. So I made a commitment to kind of focus in locally and to think about the same questions that I was thinking about in these other countries here in the U.S. And so trying to really understand the conditions under which we see or might expect institutional changes in policing. And again, but in both directions. And so I spent a lot of time listening to our conversation in our own community in terms of the Reimagining Policing initiative. And a few observations kind of came to me, and I kind of wanted to spend this time just kind of sharing those. And kind of providing potentially a framework for thinking about when exactly we might see change and when we might see change in this other direction that might be a bit more harmful. And so reading back about the history of the Ithaca Police Department in particular, one of the first things I wanted to try to understand is when did they get the SWAT team and the SWAT vehicle, right? This is kind of one of the recommendations to get rid of the SWAT vehicle. And it happened in 1996. In response to the killing of a police officer. Mm-hmm. And so there was an organized effort by, I'm assuming probably the police union, to try to move towards more militarization. And as we know, SWAT teams became the fad starting in the 1960s. Nearly every local, no matter how small the police department, has a SWAT team. And so I think if the Ithaca Police Department kind of got swept into this and they had this excuse, right, essentially of this police officer who died. And so that, to me, I interpret as kind of the, there was a political moment for the police to get what they wanted, essentially, right? They used the killing of this police officer to kind of negotiate what they needed. And this negotiation happens with the city government. Right, it's the mayor and it's the city council that is constantly bargaining with the police departments in terms of, what kinds of reforms are going to happen, what kind of oversight is going to happen, what kind of changes are going to happen. And it's this bargaining that I think that we really need to constantly pay attention to, because that's where these kinds of decisions are being made. And so because there was political momentum, I think, in 1996, we got a militarized police department. Right. And that's what we've been stuck with, since then. And so, the events of last summer kind of moved the pendulum the other way, where all of a sudden there was this political opportunity, in quotes, for potential reform, whatever we want to call that. And that, again, with the mayor's, initiative, the Reimagining Policing Initiative, and I know URO and many of you were involved in kind of the data gathering process. And watching the community response to its introduction, I guess, I wasn't too surprised, honestly, about the kind of like the public response, which was, a lot of criticism from the police and a lot of criticism from the community as well. Mainly because the other kind of observation is that the process for how these things happen matter almost as much as like what that end result is going to be. And I just don't see how a process can be completely inclusive of everyone that I think URO did a fantastic job, and Jamila did a fantastic job in trying to get as many people to the table as possible. But at some point there's kind of a limitation in terms of like how inclusive that process is going to be. And then if you know that end result is going to be bargained with, which it was, right? We have a watered down version essentially. Then what's the point in participating at all, right? So we have these kind of two points of contention, if you will, that I just wanted to highlight, which is this bargaining process that continually happens with the city government and with policing that is often invisible to the public. Right? We don't see that bargaining happen. And Ithaca is a very unique case because we actually don't have a union contract, but that doesn't mean that bargaining doesn't happen. And we saw that it did in this case with the Reimagining Policing Initiative. And the other point that I wanted to make is that the process is really important. So anytime we see the process for any kind of change, people are not going to have buy-in in the outcome or in the end product unless they feel included, and that end product includes some part of their voice. And I have this isn't an observation just here in Ithaca, but this is an observation with some of the other work that I've done in other countries, where in presenting any idea for change. If you don't vet those ideas with the community, if you don't vet those ideas with people that are involved, you're just not ever going to get the buy-in. And I think that's part of the problem. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That is absolutely at the crux of the issue here, how policy and the community have to be interconnected if we're to make change. Thank you for sharing that. Now at this point, we're going to jump into questions, and we have some really brilliant questions that have been compiled by our esteemed group here, and then we'll open it up to questions from folks who are participating out in the community who are tuning in. But at this point, I'll ask a series of questions of each of you, and I'll ask them of a singular person. But if you're not the person I'm asking directly, if you have something to contribute, please feel free to after that person's done speaking, and we'll just jump in. Darnell, you have the first question, and it is: what can you tell us about the impact of carceral trauma on a person's ability to heal and become a functioning person in society?
A lot of people have adverse childhood experiences who are incarcerated. That's commonly known. Many of the folks I met while in prison had some very traumatic childhoods, growing up in the projects, witnessing gun violence, being victims of gun violence themselves, only to them be incarcerated for gun violence. So, my brother and I, who I was incarcerated with at 5 Points Correctional Facility, had the privilege, I would say, of participating in what's called the Youth Assistance Program. And it was a unique program that my brother had really started at the age of 23, because we were incarcerated from our early 20s into our late 30s. And, it really allowed us to deal with some of that trauma by relaying our stories to at-risk youth that were coming in as part of diversion programs. So we worked with Seneca County Probation, and we really were able to draw on our experiences to kind of sway some of the youth who were coming in to make better choices. But I would say that that exercise, that program allowed me to cope with some of the traumatic experiences in my own childhood. But there aren't many programs like that, right? There aren't programs that really encourage folks to interrogate, some of the choices they made when they were young or some of the experiences they went through. Everyone who participated in the program was vulnerable and relayed some of the most sensitive subjects about, their upbringing. Most of the programs that are mandated by docs don't do that, like the standard drug treatment programs or anger management. It's very perfunctory in some respects, right? You just complete the program for purposes of getting out, and you check the boxes and you get out. There's nothing like YAP that I've seen that people have that can allow them to deal with some of the choices and the trauma that they went through in their teen years or in their childhood. But there were only 5 people at 5 points who were able to participate in that program out of a population of 1,500. And it was restrictive. Only people who committed crimes of arson or other types of offenses were precluded from even applying to be in that program. But it also gave us a sense of purpose, despite not having college, despite not having, certain other educational opportunities within the prison. We were able to, for all those years, find some sense of purpose and find some good that we were doing, right, while in prison, while incarcerated. And I think giving people opportunity, letting them know that there's a pathway for them once they're released is vital to them dealing with that trauma. I always speak about, college and prison wasn't just a formal education for me. It was also a social education. It was a way of letting us know, letting my brother and I know, and many of the folks who are in that first cohort of students with me, that there was a welcoming community on the outside. Like, for the most part, you don't know that, or that's not apparent, when you're walking the corridors of a maximum security prison. You have the corrections culture, and then you have the criminogenic environment of the prison itself. And, there aren't many of those human experiences, right? Those basic experiences that let you know that, despite whatever wrongs you've committed, there's a pathway for you. And I think providing some opportunities to folks who are on the inside, whether through education, whether through therapeutic programs like YAP, is a way to help folks get past some of the trauma that they dealt with. And just giving people a sense of hope, right? To tell someone that they're hopeless could only exacerbate the trauma that they're suffering, right? And that's what, our punitive sentencing system has done. It's told, a large population of folks that they are hopeless. Today, despite some of the progress we've seen in sentencing, I think of the decision in Miller versus Alabama, which banned mandatory life without parole sentences for children. And it seemed to imply that you could not sentence a child to life without the possibility of parole unless you made a finding that the child was permanently incorrigible. At least that's what the language of the decision suggested. But just the other day, the US Supreme Court handed down a decision in Jones versus Mississippi saying that that's not the case. Sentencing judges don't have to make that determination. Just as long as they have the discretion to impose a sentence that's not life without parole, the fact that they ultimately do is something that you cannot challenge. So, again, we're back to a system that doesn't really recognize the humanity of folks who are incarcerated, deprives them of opportunities to change. And I think, that could only worsen some of the trauma that they're going through.
Thank you, Darnell. Yeah, the being incarcerated in and of itself is a message that you are hopeless. There's no hope for you. You must be locked up, let alone something that you've experienced there. Would anybody else like to chime in on this question? Okay, I will move on. Shawanna, this question is for you. Can you explain post-traumatic prison disorder? You had mentioned that earlier, and the policy that you created to address it. Would you go a little bit more in depth? And then how would the reentry population be impacted? And what would be the overarching impact on communities that adopted the policy?
Absolutely. So post-traumatic prison disorder aims to address how docs deals with mental illness. So in my bill, I asked for vendor therapy. Vendor therapy was highly important. That means that the doctor that I just heard from on this panel could be a vendor in prison. That means that the doctor on my board, Dr. Corlin Hunt Griffith, could be a vendor, because we are clear that the therapists that are currently working in docs are not qualified, and that docs has all the doctors and all the people that cannot function in society. They no longer can work. They don't have their licenses. They've been revoked. They're the trash that the free world didn't want. They're working in prisons. And not even too far from here, like even in Fishkill, I go visit men there, and they inform me that their therapist is a student. She's a college student. I said, she's not equipped. And we do all of this so we don't have to pay people. And so vendor therapy was very important. And that we engage people. I'm asking for trauma-informed therapy, because we're clear that prison is traumatic. You got here in trauma. And if we do not find capable people to deal with your trauma, you're never going to get it. I ask for alternatives to medication, because prison is the biggest drug dealer in America. And you cannot give out medication with no diagnosis. And so I'm asking that 14 days within incarceration, that you are assessed by a trauma-informed therapist with a psychosocial, and that guards be mandated to therapy, because they create harm. They also go to an environment every day that is out of their habitat. And you know what? Some of them have a longer sentence than we do. Some people have been on their job 20 and 30 years. They are inundated to violence, and they become violent. And they are not mandated to any type of therapy. And so upon taking that job, you should be mandated to therapy to reduce harm. And I ask for alternative therapy. Therapy is not a one-size-fits-all box. And so if you look through the bill, I had art therapy, talk therapy, journalism, all yoga, meditation. Everybody takes something different. And I want everybody to have an individual, like an IEP if you were in school, an individualized service plan. Because we can't just say, okay, mental health, and just throw everybody into a therapist. Everybody's different, and everybody is somewhere different. Some people can't even talk about their trauma yet. So the bill aims to meet people where they are emotionally, and you know, and where they are, and you have to deal with them that way. And so it aims to do all these things, and it aims at the state and the Senate and the Assembly will get a report, because oftentimes we write bills, but nobody ever knows what happens, because Cox doesn't have to report anything. And so there are great bills that are written. Nobody sees, there's no oversight, so nobody knows what happens. And so for New York, there is oversight that they have to turn in a yearly report to say these many people, all these things, where they are, what happens, that they leave with Medicaid. Because what happens is, if a person is on medication, they're going to wait 45 days to get a Medicaid card, to go see a doctor. So now you've lapsed. And now that's a problem. And so even if you're trying to get a therapist to talk to you, because coming home is rough, if you don't leave with a Medicaid card, you're not going to get a doctor. And you're only going to get a psychiatrist who's only going to give you medication. And you might just need a consultation. And so I think that's very important. And so alternative post-incarceration is that you are afforded the same therapies and the same things that you were while you were incarcerated on the journey healing home. And that's basically, what the bill aims and looks to do. In Michigan, it looks a little different. I asked for marijuana post-incarceration because it's legal there as therapy. Because you'll give it to people from postpartum depression, you'll give it to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, you'll give it to people with cancer, but we're not so apt to give it to formerly incarcerated people. And so the challenge with that is parole and probation. It's a heck of a challenge. But I said the only way we're going to get reparations for people who are football numbers for marijuana is that somebody's going to have to add in some legislation. So this time I was bold enough to put it in there. All you can do is take it out and say no. But those are, the pivotal things that the legislation looks like. And I'm actually working with the lady on my board, Dr. Carolyn Hunt Griffin, who works for the UN, and she has her own organization. She's a human industrial trauma psychologist, to get it in the DSM-5. Because what I know is that this is going to be a long road. But people coming home from prison do not get the same benefits as people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Because we look at people coming home from the military as heroes. We look at people coming home from prison adverse, and the benefits are just not there. And so if I was property of the state of California or New York or wherever, then you mess me up and you are entitled to fix me. And so it's in the DSM-5. That means it's a diagnosis, and that means you mess me up. Now you're going to pay to fix me. And so, the states are talking about the bill. I said, how much does it cost to incarcerate? Because we've made prison the catch-all for mental health issues, for people who do drugs, for people in poverty. Prison is the catch-all for everything the world doesn't want. And so my bill aims to separate this and deal with mental health as it's supposed to be dealt with, because people who are incarcerated and coming home are in trauma. I've not met one person that is not in trauma. If somebody comes home from prison and says there's nothing wrong, that means there's really something wrong. Because there's no way you can go to an environment that is not fit for animals and come home and you're mentally okay. We learn to be okay. We work on ourselves, but I can't afford a therapist at $65 and $100. And since you pay to incarcerate me at $45,000 a person, how about you pay to fix me? And this is what the bill aims and seeks to do. And it's one drop in the bucket of a multitude of problems that need solutions. And what was the second part of the question, Ms. Núñez?
It was, and I think you might have answered it, what would be the overarching impact on communities who adopted or that have adopted the policy? And I think you touched on it. When you have healed people, you have healed communities.
Reducing recidivism. Our communities are sick. And so, listen, I'll be the first one to raise my hand and say, as an African-American woman, I lived in Black communities my entire existence, and we live in the military policy of don't ask, don't tell. So we just have generational legacies of trauma. Before we even hit a prison, we are in prison in our own communities because we are in trauma. And if we aim to make people well, what it does for your community is reduce recidivism. It reduces crime. It brings back stability and sustainability to neighborhoods that are yet disenfranchised and in despair. Because if we can create wellness, then we can create wholeness, and we can get back to working on an economy in our neighborhoods that are disenfranchised. But if a human's mind is not right, we're going to continue to languish and be stagnated in our community. So that's what I believe it brings to the community. It's actually bringing one back, because we're watching our corners and our blocks, and we are in trouble. We are in a mental health state of emergency in the minority community. And we have to take the stigma out of mental health services. And we have to say, if it hurts, say ouch and let's treat it. Because our community owns that mental health issue.
Thank you so much, Shawanna. Open it up to the group. Anybody want to chime in? Anybody working with mental health?
So I do want to add two things. I mean, first, Shawanna, you led me to realize I need to correct myself, right? I said back when I had that first job that it was good enough to be a warm, empathic person. It wasn't good enough. It was better than what they had, right? But you make a really important point. In any other setting, we expect evidence-based practice and empirically supported treatments when we treat PTSD. I worked in VA hospitals, and they are the gold standard for PTSD treatment. There's absolutely no reason that's not what we're offering to people during and post incarceration. And the one other thing I wanted to mention, another barrier, and I don't know how many people watching know this, that not only are you going to get subpar treatment and you're going to wait a long time, you may actually then have to come up with a copay for it while you're incarcerated. Have to figure out how to pay your copay for that medication or for that visit after you've waited and you're not getting that care. It's an absurdity of the system.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessye. And that's a good segue. I have a question for you. Can you talk about the historical and ongoing impact of interactions with police and the criminal justice system on the mental health and health outcomes of the Black community, specifically addressing Black males who are most often the victims of police brutality?
Yeah, so the answer is I could talk for days about that, and I'm not going to. I did get a little overzealous, in collecting my information, but I'm just going to give you some highlights, and I'm going to talk on two levels, right? So we know that there are individual level effects on the mental health of Black and Brown people following police contact. We know that police contact, police victimization, incarceration, all have significant impacts on individuals and the people who they live with and around. And then we also know that there are community level impacts. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of pieces there. I'll say we have great research and we need so much more to truly understand. And at the end of my comments, I'm going to mention a really interesting sort of theoretical model around looking at why police violence is different and how we may actually be able to trace it as the one ideological factor in specific mental health problems, right? So drawing that direct line between the types of mental health effects that are specifically related to police violence, because police violence is different from other violence in some really significant ways. So we have a number of studies that show the detrimental effects of any police police encounters. So a 2014 study of 18 to 26-year-old men in New York City found that 85% of them had been stopped at some point in their lives. About half had been stopped within the last year. This was in the sort of height of stop and frisk, which again, we called proactive policing, moving into this place where we're putting police in the faces of people, regardless of what they're doing. So we know that these stop and frisk policies, these high frequency encounters, that any encounter raise the risk of adverse mental health effects. Anxiety symptoms were significantly related to how many times people were stopped, how the stop was conducted, and then they measured the level of invasiveness of the stop. So how invasive, how intrusive was it? And that level of invasiveness was a significant predictor of PTSD. This is just police contact. We're not even talking about arrest or incarceration. And then we have this theory, the strain theory, where we look at acute stressors or aggregate stressors that then increase the likelihood of so-called criminal behavior, because the anger and psychological distress that come from that original stressor provoke someone. So in another study of adolescent Black and Latinx boys, They were more likely to engage in criminal behavior 6, 12, and 18 months later, but essentially that was a direct result of the stress that they experienced from that police contact. Not surprisingly, every study of police victimization has found that every type of victimization is experienced more frequently in Black and Brown communities, and all of those lead to higher rates of depression. There was a nearly twofold increase in negative mental health outcomes for Black people who had previous police interactions compared to Black people who had had no encounters with the police. So Darnell mentioned ACEs, so the adverse childhood events. We know that for people who are incarcerated, they have experienced those adverse childhood events at 4 times the rate of the general population. About 87% of incarcerated males experience some trauma exposure prior to incarceration. Half of those men said they were exposed to 7 to 10 different types of traumatic experiences, not individual traumas, 7 to 10 different types of trauma before incarceration. And we know that many of them were re-traumatized repeatedly, just as Shawanna talked about, while incarcerated. Exposure to trauma is associated with all indicators of contact with the criminal justice system. And I think what we're talking about here that's really important is the trauma that results from, not thinking about trauma as the causal factor. So in terms of thinking about how contact with the police and incarceration affects health and mental health, we know that being arrested or being incarcerated is a primary stressor. That has a direct influence on people's mental health and their physical health. But then that leads to additional secondary stressors, right? So you've got the initial arrest or incarceration, and then what happens? So we've heard about this already tonight. After you're released from prison, there's stigma. There's a lack of employment opportunities. I got to hear some of the people on this panel speak last week with Dr. Miller, and listening to him talk about all of those barriers to employment after incarceration, financial challenges. Then those are secondary stressors that are cumulative, and they add to that adverse impact on people's mental health and their physical health. So briefly, I just want to talk about the mental health effects of police brutality that extend well beyond the people who have had direct contact with the police, and extend deep and insidiously into Black and Brown communities as a whole. So a 2018 study in The Lancet, which is a medical journal, found that police killings of unarmed Black people led to poor mental health outcomes for all Black people living in the state in which the shooting occurred. So if you were a Black person living in a state, which unfortunately now is more and more common, where there was a police killing of an unarmed Black person, your mental health outcomes are likely to suffer. A year, 14 months ago, we were all struggling already with historic levels of mental health problems. Within a week of George Floyd's death, rates of anxiety and depression among Black Americans shot to higher rates than experienced by any other racial or ethnic group. And specifically, those screening positive for symptoms of anxiety or depression went from 36 to 41%. And that represents 1.4 more Black people in this community, in this country, within a week who reported symptoms that hadn't previously.
Could you state the name of those articles that you were just sourcing?
Sure, I can give you, could I give you could I give you authors in the comments there?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, I was accumulating quite a lot. So the last thing I want to talk to you about, because I really want to make sure that we have time for everyone. So again, social determinants of health is a big buzzword right now, and legitimately and importantly so, right? We're looking at those economic and social conditions that influence individual and group differences in health, and we are able to recognize more and more that the experiences of incarceration, the experiences of police victimization, the experiences of police contact have a significant impact. So I mentioned to you this study in 2020, so I'm probably going to pronounce the name wrong, but DeVilder, Fedina, and Link. And so this is this theoretical model of police violence as different and possibly as a direct sort of determinant of mental health. And so just briefly, they look at how it may be different from other processes. Police violence may be different from other processes that than other violence exposure. So sorry, it has a unique impact on mental health because it is very different in specific ways from other violence exposure. So they talk about police violence as state sanctioned in a way that no other violence is endorsed. They talk about the pervasive presence of police, different from other perpetrators of violence. They talk about police violence altering deeply held beliefs about safety and trust and security. And again, I think none of this is going to be a surprise to anyone on this call. And they also talk about the limited options for recourse. So whether you're incarcerated or not, if you are a victim of violence at the hands of the police, you have extremely limited resources for recourse. So I think, it's unusual for me to talk about all the problems and not the intervention. So I was glad a minute ago I got to talk about some of the possible interventions, but I think it's very clear that the need for exactly what Shawanna was talking about, mental health services, before, how about we try prevention? So some mental health services for people who have high ACEs scores before they ever get locked up, while incarcerated, and then post-incarceration. Part of any reentry plan should be exactly that, getting people the psychological mental health support that is based in science and with evidence that they need. So thanks, I'll wrap up with that.
Thank you so much, Jessye. I know you mentioned the Lancet and a few others, and we'll post those to the chat as well. And Jamila has shared some articles in there as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. Those statistics are deeply disturbing and deeply felt. Thank you. Jamila, could I ask you, within the reimagining policing recommendations, what do you see that will address the traumatization of poor and marginalized communities? And what aspects of the recommendations do you see as potentially harmful for those same communities?
Yeah, this is a good question, but a hard one. And I'm going to try to be super, super brief. I know it'll feel like like I talk for like 10 seconds, but I want to be mindful of the time and make sure that other folks get a chance also to have input. And I will say that one of the things that makes this a difficult question, and difficult doesn't mean bad, just difficult, is that there are like 19 recommendations, So the recommendations are really wide ranging, and they're really sort of distinctly different in terms of like the level. Some of these things are kind of like changes around the margins or suggestions about institutions that we want to create that can maybe help some of these problems, but we're not sure. And others are much more fundamental. So one of the big ones I think that got the most kind of airtime and probably the most pushback was this recommendation to replace the city of Ithaca Police Department with something else, right? Like a public safety department, a community solutions and public safety department. And as my colleague Sabrina said earlier, these recommendations ultimately, the original recommendations in the report are really different than what Ithaca City and Tompkins County ended up sort of moving forward with. And so, there's not going to be any replacing of the police department. And we might think of that, given everything that Jessye just shared about all of the harms that come from over-policing, inappropriate policing, and the trauma that comes from even any police contact right now. Thinking about creating a completely different institutional form that sends different people out into communities to address problems in very different ways would have represented a real opportunity to turn the tide in terms of some of the more traumatizing and difficult experiences that people have with police and police enforcement. And often, and I'll say this as a general thing, because like there's too many recommendations to get into them each specifically. So I guess the general point that I'll make is that the more transformative recommendations that have to do with really like either removing or completely reorienting the recommendations that are really truly in a transformative way about reimagining what we have now and building something different are the ones that have the most possibility as far as changing some of these outcomes that we've been talking about throughout this panel, but they're also the ones that have gotten the most pushback, right? They're the ones that are sort of most against the grain, against the status quo, and they disrupt that status quo. They disrupt actors that have a lot of power and a lot of input, like police unions and police officers, and threaten their livelihood, their status, right? And so they create a certain kind of politics that makes it quite difficult for those sorts of interventions to really happen. And I will say some of these other recommendations are really just about like us knowing more about the problem, right? Like a public safety community dashboard. It's like, okay, well, there's more transparency. We maybe can see more clearly what's happening. There are different recommendations around collecting data. Look, as a social scientist, I'm like, yeah, let's get the data. Let's have transparency. Let's see what's going on. But as a social scientist that's a political scientist, I know that those things don't necessarily actually lead to change, and that we can keep studying the problem, getting more data, learning more about it. Oh, now we have more transparency. And that doesn't actually mean that the material conditions of people's lives are going to be changed. And I guess I'll just end by saying, you know, in my role with the Reimagining Public Safety, I didn't have a role in drafting the report, but did have a role, as I mentioned before, in conducting some of the focus groups. And the reason why I agreed to be involved and to participate in that, there were a lot of people who were participating in the Reimagining Public Safety Collaborative who were amazing people operating in good faith, hoping that they could in some way push something forward that would change the material conditions, particularly of folks on the economic and racial margins in our community. And many of us were like, is this really gonna happen? And one of the things that happened in some of the focus groups I conducted was that I realized that kind of cynicism, that cautiousness, that concern about where is this really gonna go? Is this gonna lead to change? What are you going to do with this information? It was palpable in every focus group. And so I guess a meta thing that I'll end with here is by saying these kinds of efforts, the reimagining efforts, to the extent that these things don't lead to real palpable change that people feel in their daily lives that shape their lived experiences, to the extent that we don't see that kind of change, this can really do more harm than good. It can just fuel the cynicism. It can deepen the belief that these institutions are never going to change. It can strengthen the status quo and reaffirm for the people who push back against some of the more transformational changes that indeed their voice, their place in the community is preserved, and also reinforce for the people who continue to suffer that indeed their voices don't matter and their place in the community continues to be marginalized and precarious. So a lot of the devil is in the details with these recommendations. And while some of the most transformative things have already been taken off the table, there's a lot that remains on the table. And whether it leads to any significant change for the most vulnerable communities is a matter of accountability. And I think there isn't enough in these recommendations to ensure accountability, and is a matter of constantly pushing politically and paying attention to like building power in this community so that the people who are most affected are able to, either in this iteration or in future iterations of processes like this, have more of a voice, more of an influence over what happens in their daily lives. So I'll stop with that.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jamila. Is there a place that we could go? I don't know if you've typed it in the chat already, but where we could see those 19 recommendations and the ones that are still on the table?
I'll put a link for you.
Thank you so much. So important for all of us to have a hand in the crafting of this. Next question, Rosa Brooks, what is the role of police training in the cycle of trauma that folks from marginalized communities experience? And does police training and policing traumatize officers and thus perpetuate traumatization?
Thanks, Christa. That's a great question. And actually, before I even answer it, just thinking about Jamila's comments, one of the things, and also about Jesse's comments about how police contacts, even contacts alone, can be so traumatizing. One of the things I think is going to be really interesting is to see what COVID-related policing changes in some cities endure and what they lead to, because of COVID, a lot of departments minimized contacts, either by saying we're not going to do misdemeanor arrests, or we're going to triage 911 calls so that we don't send officers when they could take a phone report, et cetera. And, you know, these obviously are things that police reform and critics had been urging for many years. They came about because of the dangers of infection in police-citizen encounters during a pandemic. But is this like this giant nationwide natural experiment with no control group in what happens if you dramatically reduce police-citizen contacts? Does the sky fall, as many in policing fear? Do things actually get better? So it'll be really interesting to see how all of that shakes out as it shakes out. On the question, Christa, that you just asked, you know, it's really hard to make generalizations about policing in this country because it's so decentralized. You know, 18,000 different law enforcement agencies, and many of them don't talk to the others and don't think they have anything to learn from the others. So on the one hand, I think there are some very good police training programs, and there are some really horrific police training programs, and there are a lot that are kind of in between good and horrific. One generalization that I think is fair to make about the majority of police training programs, and this goes back to the earlier Sabrina's points about militarization, is that most of them are still modeled on military boot camps. They're kind of boot camp style training. And in fact, they're sort of modeled on parodies of military boot camps that even the military doesn't do anymore. And there's a lot of, you know, get down and give me 20, you know, your shoes aren't shined enough, you know, so you've got to do punishment push-ups or a punishment run. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. The only thing I want to hear from you is yes, sir, no, sir, you know, right away, sir. I think it's actually a form of police militarization that has deeper roots. Is really worth thinking about the kind of the cultural and organizational aspects of police militarization that go way beyond, you know, do cops have tanks to drive around in, or, you know, military style body armor. And indeed, I think that the history of militarization in American policing runs very deep, back to the mid 19th century, certainly. But I do think that particular kind of training, yes, it absolutely can be traumatizing for officers. Who you know, the justification that is usually given by police departments for that kind of training is, well, you know, officers are going to have to operate under intense pressure. There will be times that people will mock them, will spit at them, will scream at them, will throw things at them. And so we're doing stress testing, we're doing stress training, which will teach them how to stay cool under pressure, because they'll have to succeed in this academy. And, you know, my own takeaway from this is that the lesson a few too many officers learn from this is that it's okay for powerful people to order people with less power around. It's okay for powerful people to yell at people who are less powerful. It's okay for powerful people to physically punish and inflict pain on those who disobey them, which, needless to say, are the worst possible lessons we want anyone to take out of it. And it also, you know, it's interesting just working with the police recruits in DC. The majority of them are college graduates at this point. Many of them come in quite idealistic with a lot of questions and a desire to be good players in the community. And that really gets beaten out of them. You know, that sort of instead a spirit of I'm just going to keep my mouth shut because otherwise somebody's going to scream at me gets inculcated. And so I think that does further trauma within police officers. It also furthers behavior by police officers that further traumatizes members of the community. You know, that kind of military, do what I say. attitude, which is part of what makes those police stops so traumatic for people, even if they don't lead to arrests. Two other quick stray interesting pieces of this. I also think that this is something I wrote about a lot in the book I just published. In so many ways, the unofficial lesson at the police academy was, anybody could kill you at any time. Any situation could turn lethal in a millisecond. There's no such thing as a routine call. And officers, it makes people very paranoid, right? Because they get this notion that everybody's trying to kill them. They go quickly from anybody could try to kill you to everybody probably is trying to kill me. And that too profoundly impacts how many officers interact with people. The most tragic outcome of an attitude like that is police officers who shoot first and ask questions later when somebody reaches into a pocket or a glove compartment. But even well below the level of sort of lethal harm, it affects how officers interact with people on the street. It affects whether they stop people, who they stop, how they stop them, how they talk to them. If you're primed to view everybody as a lethal threat, number one, lots of implicit biases can creep right in there. But number two, you're more likely to be, officers are themselves more likely to be fearful during interactions, and that can turn into a lot of really bad behavior. And then the final point, and this is just a question, I guess, for everybody else, or an area for further research. Studies of who enlists in the military and in the enlisted Corps have found that those who enlist in the military are much more likely than those who don't to have suffered numerous adverse childhood experiences. And it sort of makes sense, right? That people look to the military as a kind of artificial family, very structured, meritocratic, and so on, that for many people who are seeking structure that they didn't have, clearer rules, pats on your head for good behavior, that is attractive. I would be really interested to know whether that is also true of police recruits. And I would bet that it is, just based on my purely anecdotal conversations with many police recruits, many of whom say, if you say, well, why did you want to become a police officer? Will say things like, because I was a victim of violent crime, or because my mother was raped, or because my best friend was shot, and I wanted to help keep people safe. And so they wouldn't have to go through things like that. And it would be really interesting to find out. To the best of my knowledge, no one has looked at this, but the degree to which that finding in enlisted military recruits also holds true for police officers, because as we know, in police officers, as in members of the community who are not police officers, a history of trauma can then be compounded by traumatizing experiences on the job, which in turn can lead to the cycle of traumatization of others as well.
I'd love your next book to be about that, because I'm very curious as well. And I would venture to say that with the rampant bullying that happens within police departments, that would potentially be true.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a quick question about, you had mentioned that police forces are decentralized. I think in some communities, we really don't see that sort of notion of decentralization. It seems like a lot of police officers are acting in lockstep, people across the country, shooting people in the back. And, it seems to be a lot of commonalities. What do you think accounts for that?
I think there are commonalities, no question, and some of that is due to that police training model, which still is prevalent in the majority of police departments, and some of it relates to the very, very low threshold for police use of force that the Supreme Court has essentially set. But that being said, I think there's huge variation between police departments. And just as police become cynical about the communities they're supposed to be serving, because the majority of the people they encounter are people who have committed crimes or been victims of crimes, and they can come to be very cynical and think, oh, everybody here is all messed up, right? That's the police stereotype. That I think similarly, the policing stories that make the media are terrible ones. And the police departments that have been transformed in significant ways don't tend to make the news, but there are some. What there is in the military and there isn't in the policing world is the hierarchical nationwide ability to say, now you're going to do this, not that anymore, and have it just filter down right away, or for that matter, sort of centralized learning organizations that are designed to do research, disseminate studies, and so on. That policing doesn't really have that, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. It makes it very, very hard to get good information out there. I also think one way where you see this, the impact of this decentralization, big city police departments, which are the ones we mostly hear about, we hear about abuses in big city police departments. I would guess that they're the best of the bunch, right? Because there's a media spotlight on them. I actually worry even more about smaller rural police departments and small town police departments, which don't tend to be subjected to the same level of scrutiny. And, we don't know what we don't know, but my guess is that you see even more bad stuff and a lot of variation, and probably a lot of just plain illegal stuff as well, going on outside of the spotlight.
Sabrina, I would love for you to chime in here as well with some of your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. No, I just had a quick couple of things on the points that Rosa was saying. So I just, in terms of the militarized training, I just wanted to point out, one of the biggest differences between the military and the police is the fact that the police have discretion, right? So they don't have a direct supervisor that is with them when they're patrolling. They have to make decisions on their own. And that is not the case with with military soldiers, right? They have to go up the chain of command for any kind of decision. And so what this militarized training is essentially doing is telling them that their first response is violence, right? That's essentially what they're being trained to as like the first, almost like as the first option almost, as opposed to really understanding the responsibility of what this discretion means. Right, because if you are the one that is making the choice for how to interact with a person in the community, you need training on that, because you're going to see a whole host of interactions with all kinds of different people, and that's what's lacking, right? Is that understanding and how to manage the responsibility of that discretion. And I just want to point out that one of the most popular trainings out there is by somebody named Dave Grossman, and he wrote a book called On Killing, literally On Killing. And this is like one of the most popular police trainings, and police officers line up to get this training and to hear him speak. And so this is what I think Rosa was saying, this is the first kind of response in terms of valuing violence over valuing peace, essentially, right, in police departments. So I just wanted to make that point real quick.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That's a good segue. I have a question for you. Globally, are there any examples of changes that we could adopt that would move us from a policing system that produces trauma to one that does not?
Yeah.
If you have any historical perspective there, feel free to weave that in as well. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I just want to clarify one quick thing that I said in my earlier statement. So I said Ithaca Police does not have a union. What I meant to say is that the Ithaca Police union does not have a contract with the city. So just point of clarification there. So yeah, one of the things that I study is when we see institutional changes in policing. And one of the common assumptions I think that we have is that the dismantling or even abolition or starting from scratch idea is rare. And actually, it's not that uncommon around the world. And so in many conflict societies in countries that have experienced rampant political violence or civil war, what you see after that is basically they dismantle the police forces, or they dismantle the security forces that were engaged in those human rights violations, and start from scratch. And one of the big decisions that these countries have to make, and I'll get to kind of how these decisions are made, is whether or not to incorporate the police officers that were engaged in human rights violations or not. And so you can understand that on one hand, this is kind of seen as a trade-off between continued peace potentially, because those are violent actors, and if you don't integrate them back in, do they continue to be violent, right? As opposed to justice, which is for the community to, and for civilians to feel like there was justice, then you have to exclude them. You cannot have the perpetrators back in positions of power. And so these kinds of decisions, and dismantling, we've seen, there's so many cases: Liberia, Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, Bosnia, et cetera, and in almost all of these cases, the choice was to dismantle and not to include the former human rights violators or, former police officers. And so there are numerous examples, globally that we can look to try to see, how does this reimagining and actual reimagining actually look like? I will say, you might say, well, the US is an exception here. Like, we haven't experienced a civil war, but I would push back on that. The US is not an exception in any way, really. And we've seen rampant violence, political violence in our own country. What happened January 6th, there are white supremacist militia groups that are, actively violent. And so we aren't too far away necessarily from the kinds of political violence that, say, Northern Ireland saw. And so I think that thinking about the fact that this is kind of not even a possibility is treating the US as an exception when it's not. One of the things that really helped in these instances was that in all of them, there was a third party that helped implement these drastic changes. So, in the case of, in almost all of these cases, the United Nations was involved, or a third party, maybe it was the US or the European Union, was involved. And that's because there's, neither sides trust each other, right? So you have to have kind of an outside actor, a third party that both sides know is going to monitor the process to ensure that it actually happens. And so, because the US is such a decentralized system, potentially the federal government could play that kind of a role, right? Is to oversee that kind of drastic change and to make sure that it actually happens. There are potentially other actors that could do that, but that was really kind of integral in terms of making sure that the actual transformational changes happened. The last thing that I just want to say about this is that, I think one of the points that Jamila made about the fact that this reimagining policing is much more than just about policing, but there's 19 reforms and there's it's more holistic than just changes to policing. I think one of the places where we can look to get some more ideas is the transitional justice literature in other countries that have experienced extreme repression or human rights violations. And so, places like Argentina or Chile or Peru, just South Africa, to name a few, where things like truth and reconciliation commissions or memorials or reparations, those kinds of activities are really helpful for collective trauma. And so taking a holistic approach to this is really important. So we can't just focus on, incarceration or just on policing. It needs to be holistic. Everything, we need healthcare. We need to think about the economy, getting people jobs, training, mental health, all of it, because you can't solve and create kind of change with just one reform to like policing or one training, right? That's just not going to work. And so that would be my suggestion is there's so many good examples out there to look for with respect to transitional justice.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Thank you so much for those insights. I want to do a time check. We're at 7:20 and we had promised to wrap up at 7. And I feel like we haven't even begun to get into community questions. I wanted to just touch base with everybody and see how we're feeling. I know at least Darnell had to jump off. Are we okay with asking the community some questions or asking the community asking us some questions? Do we have a few more minutes? I'm going to assume your silence is a yes. At this point, you need to go.
So could we sort of say till 7:30 and then?
I think that would be a good idea. We got 9 minutes. Rosie, do you need to go?
I do. I'm afraid I do. But thank you, everybody. This was a really, really interesting conversation. I'm really sorry I can't stay longer, but thank you all.
Thanks for your time, Rosa. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Keep up the great work. All right. Do we have questions that we are receiving from our community out there. I'm going to ask our interns. While we wait for those questions, I have a final question here for everyone. And we can just do this like popcorn. If anybody wants to chime in, just jump in. How do we move from where we are now to a place of healing between marginalized communities, the police, and communities that are privileged to not have these experiences? So how do we move from where we are now to a place of healing?
I think that is the question. I think that Sabrina sort of answered some of this towards the end of her comments just now, and I guess I really want to amplify what she said, which is to think about like what healing actually looks like. And I don't know that we're very good at that in this country. I think that we have lots of examples of like various forms of oppression and domination that have been like super targeted against particular groups for either short or long periods of time. So we have lots of examples of that in our history and contemporarily, but relatively few examples of like what healing actually looked like, right? I mean, we can think about like reparations in the case of Japanese internment, and maybe there are a couple of other examples, but I think that we're sort of long on hurt and short on healing in this country. And so I guess that even the question itself is like, the first thing is like, let's ask that question more. And then let's think about it in a way that's kind of broad and capacious, but not like fuzzy, like, oh, we'll just think about this in the broadest terms, like, and not do anything about it. There are some like really concrete things we can do as far as like identifying communities that have been targeted and making recompense in really direct ways. You know, when we think about even really recent initiatives and policy programs like stop and frisk in New York City, and it's like, we have all the evidence that that was targeting Black and brown folks, and that even though they were over targeted, it turned out that they were sort of like, you know, not nearly as likely to need to be targeted, to have, to be violating the various laws that were said to justify that targeting. You know, when we can like identify particular communities like that have been harmed by policy, I think that we should then have a responsibility to do something about that. And some of that is about creating connections between communities and discourse and empathetic listening and all of that. And some of it is about actual material resources, right? Like giving people something because they've lost something, and what they've lost isn't necessarily able to be supplied through material resources, but that's a place to start. But I just want to say, I really think we can draw on other examples and think about, what does healing look like? What does reconciliation look like? And it's not just brushing it under the rug and moving on, or forgiving and moving on. It really is about what kinds of concrete changes need to happen in order to provide some like recourse in these communities that have been suffering.
Yeah, recompense. Maybe if we call it recompense instead of reparations, maybe it'll happen. I love that. Thank you so much, Jamila. I have a question. Professor Karim, were you able to determine where the funding for the SWAT team training and upkeep of weapons came from? That's a question from a community member.
So I did not look into where the funding came from, but I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't come from the 1033 program, which was a federal program that gave, which it basically gave for free any communities that wanted kind of excess military equipment. They could get it for free, essentially. So that would be my guess. I don't hold me to that. I can get back to you on that question as I look into it further, but that would be my guess.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any last comments? Thank you so much, Jamila. I know you have to jump off as well. Any last comments? Any last things to share? Thank you all so deeply for everything you shared tonight about your work in this vital issue. I am confident that we're on a road to healing with as much energy as all of you are putting into involving community members in direct action along these lines. And with more eyes on it, we will make change. I am hopeful. Any last comments from any of you? Thank you so much. And thank you to URO. Thank you for this amazing platform. Taili, Mugambee, and your staff. Thank you so much to the community for joining. If you want to continue having these conversations, please join the URO team in their YouTube channel, and a series of interviews and panel discussions will ensue. And for more opportunities to interact and take action on these, please connect with that group. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks to our fearless moderator.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Much love to you.